Welcome everyone to the Tippy webinar series. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today. My name is Ashley Durham and I am the Director of Alumni Engagement at the Tippy College of Business. The Tippy webinar series is an initiative of our Alumni Relations Department. Our goal is to bring the knowledge of our faculty and staff to you wherever you may be in the world. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar entitled Elements of an Exceptional Slide Deck. Just some information before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box, not the chat, in your Zoom control panel, and I will bring them up during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. As a reminder, all of our virtual presentations are uploaded to the college's YouTube page a few days following our live webinar event. Finally, you are encouraged to stay until the end of the webinar so that we can gather your thoughts on today's presentation. Your feedback helps make our virtual programming even better, so we appreciate you taking time to answer our 4-question survey at the end of our session today. I would now like to introduce Nick Westergaard. Nick is an author, educator, and speaker. He spent his career building standout brands at organizations of all sizes, from small businesses to Fortune 500 companies to President Obama's Jobs Council. As a lecturer at the Tippy College of Business, he leads the StoryLab program. He's the author of books Brand Now and Get Scrappy, a contributor to the Harvard Business Review, host of the popular On Brand podcast, a Moth StorySLAM Champion, and a TEDx speaker coach. An in-demand keynote speaker at conferences throughout the world, his work helps those struggling to stand out in our crowded, distracted world. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your expertise with us, Nick.
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley. I am excited to be here to chat a bit about the elements of an exceptional slide deck, because we need an exceptional slide deck in this day and age that we find ourselves in. That is because at this very moment, we have more technology in our pockets than the astronauts took with them to the moon. And what this means is that the economics of attention have changed. Now, what does that really mean? Well, we've all heard the thing that people these days apparently have the attention span less than that of a goldfish. However, no one's ever bothered to explain how they've gathered that data and studied the attention span of said goldfish, but I digress. What it means is that there's 2.5 quintillion bytes of data created each and every day. And of the data collected in history, 90% of it has been gathered in the past 2 years, and 90% of that data transmitted online today is visual. It's a whole lot of information, whole lot of it's visual. It could sound like this is the time of visuals, but visuals have always been a part of our communication and storytelling. When we told stories of the great hunt, of the weather systems, of the passage of time, ancient civilizations would use not PowerPoint, but visual aids in the form of cave drawings, maps, and calendars. That's because visuals help us to tell these stories, and they also help us to shape and share our business ideas. My favorite example, low-tech example, is the storied back of the napkin drawing by Herb Kelleher plotting out that triad that led to the hubs of Southwest Airlines. So we're going to take it a bit beyond napkins here today. We're going to talk about the power of visuals. We're going to look at some design principles, and then we're going to look at how we can use data effectively and further add engagement to our slides, and ultimately, not just next steps, but exceptional next steps as well. So to start this conversation, why does something like a napkin, something visually, drive action? And that leads us to our first section on the power of visuals. So there's that old saying that tells us that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I love it when the data much better than the goldfish thing, backs up these sayings because of something called the picture superiority effect. And that comes to us from Alan Pavio, who, among other things, gave us dual coding theory. And what that tells us is that the verbal and the visual are coded via two different channels in the brain. So we have our words coded, and then when we see an image, we not only make the word in our verbal processing system, but we also tag that visual mentally also. So images are very powerful. As Dr. Leo Chalupa notes, more of the brain is devoted to vision and visual processing than any other known function, including language. More neurons in the human brain are involved in vision than all other sensory modalities combined. So picture superiority effect is kind of an earned name because with the superiority of pictures, we get a better recall of our idea, better comprehension from our audience, and what's really important here is better for diverse learning styles as well. So as important as visuals are, first thing we do is click on PowerPoint and start smashing slides together. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, PowerPoint is the second most popular tool after email. But in a quote that I'm going to reference in all three of our sections, because it's just that important, is this idea from Nancy Duarte. And that's that slides should support your presentation, but they shouldn't be your presentation. So before we click PowerPoint, it's important to ask ourselves a couple of key questions first on the context of the presentation that we're creating. Who's your audience? What do you want them to do? And how will you use visuals or data to help you make this point? Another important thing to think of is what Duarte calls the big idea. And that's an equation as represented here, but it's an equation that we often only think of half of. It's your point of view, so what you know, and what's at stake for your audience as well. That last part is what we often forget. And it's important to have that mapped out before you click on that PowerPoint icon. But once it's time to start creating slides, that's where we get to some effective design principles. So this could be, it is a webinar right now, but it could be a whole course, a whole day in and of itself. But what I want to talk you through are 6 simple slide design principles. So the first question is, are slides needed? Now, I know we were just talking about the picture superiority effect, but we can't take a one-size-fits-all approach. Now, I don't want anyone to confuse the fact that I'm talking about PowerPoint and our use of it negatively occasionally for thinking that down with PowerPoint, because it can do all sorts of great things. We can create documents. We can create visually appealing slides. It can serve as our teleprompter. Don't make it do all of those things at once. Here's the next appearance of that reminder of the Duarte quote that they should support your presentation. They shouldn't be your presentation. And yet when we go into a presentation, we treat everything like it's a click, talk, click, talk, click, talk, click, talk, instead of thinking about what's the best fit for this audience that I'm talking to. In Nancy Duarte's book, The HBR Guide to Persuasive Presentations, which we use in the Iowa MBA program, she plots this out on an axis of audience size. So you've got small and large. And then on the y-axis, you've got the formality of your event, of your speaking, informal to formal. So anyone out there with a consultative mindset sees this and knows that you can fill in those quadrants. So if you've got something that's a small audience and it's informal, then it's something that's probably more of a conversation. If you're using slides, They should really be treated as read-aheads or handouts that you can look at. I've been guilty of going into a meeting thinking I needed to prepare an entire slide deck and realizing I'm meeting with one person at a coffee shop. Going through a whole deck together is a little awkward. As it gets a little bit more formal, but still small, it's more of an interactive presentation, some basic slides with discussion prompts. This is a lot of the meetings that we facilitate and run through. And as the audience gets a little bigger, but the format stays formal, we've got more of a formal presentation, a full presentation deck with polished visuals. And I'd say this is what you're looking at right now. And it is if you're one of our audience members in real time. But if you're joining us after the fact in the recording, then it would be the large audience in an informal setting. So it's those people watching asynchronously. So the problem is the click talk, we tend to treat everything like it's that upper right quadrant of creating a full presentation for everything. And that's why, according to HBR, 50% of presentations are mismatched with their intended audience. So our next step from here is storyboarding for success. Now, Pixar is one of the greatest visual storytellers of our era, but they don't animate a single pixel until they sketch out each and every frame. And I love sharing this in business classes because they do this not for artistic reasons alone, but for business-driven reasons, because like so many of us, their time and talent is their biggest, greatest expenditure. So they have to know where Woody the Cowboy Doll's hat is in each and every scene before they start animating. Now, I'm a big fan of using sticky notes. In fact, fun visual aid right here, I'm working on some new content right here, and different notes mean different things. But it's great because it forces you to be clear and concise. More on that in a bit, but they're also sticky. You can move them around. And these analog tools are important because, believe it or not, another thing that's been studied is when we spend all morning in PowerPoint, in Excel, making beautiful things, when it doesn't work, when we start practicing our presentation, we're less likely to cut it because we've developed an emotional attachment to it. Another thing to remember about slides is our third principle, that slides are glance media. So first, some definitions. If it can be understood without you, that's great, but it's a document. Send it out to people to read. Don't project it and then read it to an audience. Conversely, if the audience doesn't need to see them, but you do, maybe you're using your slides as a teleprompter, then don't project them. Now, this sounds like an offbeat example, but if you watch Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In TED Talk, she doesn't have slides that you can see from the audience's view, but when they switch to other camera angles, the monitors at the foot of the stage are actually running PowerPoint with an outline type reminders for her. You can do the same thing, just don't project what's on your laptop. But if you are projecting slides, it's important to keep in mind this idea of glance media. And glance media, great example, is a billboard. So you want to keep it clear and concise here. We want to simplify and clarify the information because every element that you add, every different font, every different color, every text box, every starburst, every fun bit of, wait a minute, this looks a little white and plain in the background. Let's get, oh, great, a gradient to boot. And if we want people to know that we are fun and lighthearted, let's go ahead and add a cat meme on there. Great. And there's a little bit of white space at the bottom. Let's add a text box there too. Awesome. Now our slide is done. Now, hopefully you haven't created a slide like this, but many of us see slides like this all the time. So we need to create slides that are visually easier to look at. In general, our eyes follow a Z-flow pattern in processing information. And we see this going all the way back to classic advertisements, where we follow the headline down across the ad through the visual interest back to the coupon call to action featured right here. And if you think, well, look at this ancient ad, you can see the same visual dynamics at play online today. When it comes to text, less is more. Fun fact, people can only process one stream of information at a time. They can either listen to you or they can look at your slides. They won't do both. Now, I read that slide almost word for word to reinforce that very point. In general, you want one idea per slide. Give each moment its own visual moment in your presentation. You don't have a limit. You're not operating from a place of scarcity with slides. A good rule of thumb is if you're getting much smaller than 28 points font size, it could be a sign that you have a little too much text. And you can avoid that by turning off that thing that pretends like it's a friendly feature. And that's that button that says shrink text to fit, because then you can fit everything. But the problem is then you've got everything on your slide. So turn that off and turn on your inner editor. 5 is find big, bold images. Now, we heard all about the picture superiority effect, but a lot of times we still fall prey to that thinking that, oh, I don't just want pretty pictures in my slides. But remember, it aids in audience recall if you show them a picture of something while you're talking about that as well. So it's more than just pretty pictures. In some of our classes here at Tippy, I do an activity called a slide design makeover, where I have folks bring in a slide that they've used beforehand, and then based on what we're talking about, based on these principles, they make it over after the fact. This was a slide that came from the College of Dentistry. And the individual that created this slide said after the fact, one, it's got that Microsoft template that we see everywhere. That's, because it's so seen, hardly exceptional. And in looking at this, she realized, I was writing my presentation in PowerPoint. I know what's in these bullet points. I don't need all of that text. So ultimately, what she was able to do in making this over was to go full screen with the big scary teeth. Definitely helps in making that point. So find big, bold visuals, but avoid visual cliches, things that people see all the time. Like we always talk about partnership and we get the picture of those two suited hands shaking. So ask yourself a fun question. What else is sort of like partnership? Maybe something goes together like peanut butter and jelly. There's all kinds of stock images out there for that. Or better still, back to the communication device that we all have in our pockets, we have better cameras than we've normally had access to. Go find and take some picture of your own. For example, sitting on my shelf looking at me right now, it's another great partnership, the dude and Walter from The Big Lebowski. So there's all kinds of visuals, unique visuals that you can find to help reinforce what you're talking about. In general, 2 fonts, 3 colors. Now, we have a whole cornucopia of fonts available, but in general, they're divided into 2 categories. You've got sans serif, like you see the A's here. Those have those little hooks or serifs at the end of them. Or you have sans serif, which I'm using below that in blue and gray. In general, sans serif is better because the letter forms are thicker and they hold up a little bit better when projected at a distance. One of my favorite bits of research to talk about comes from the University of Michigan, where Song and Schwartz had what they called the fussy fonts study, and they showed 2 groups the same recipe 2 different ways. One saw it in a plain Arial or Helvetica, the other in a formal script font. And the group that saw, again, the same recipe thought it was a harder, more challenging recipe when it was in that flowery script font. So why this applies to our work is, though we think fun fonts might be cool, we want to make sure that it's not hard for our audience to process that information, because when it's hard for them to process, they're going to perceive what you're talking about as that much more challenging as well. You also want to create contrast with your colors. Quick flashback to elementary school art class where you've got the color wheel. The cool colors, your greens, blues, purples, appear to recede. They're good for text, background elements. Your warm colors are the colors that are red, orange, yellow. They are good for accents because they appear to advance towards you. Complementary colors are across from one another on the color wheel and go well together, so you can pick a pair pretty easily there as well. You can use a triad, which you'll note that I'm doing now, moving between red, blue, and gold. And you can also use an analogous palette within a section of the color wheel. Speaking of colors, white space is your friend, but white space technically isn't a color, because what defines white space is the absence of information. So taking away things helps your audience to focus on what's there. So those are our 6 simple slide principles. And I say principles because it's real easy to sit down to something like this, to hear someone say things, and to hear it as always, never. And that's why it's important to point out that these are not black and white rules, but rather gray on gray principles that we can apply, like we've seen in the makeover project. So when we start with something like this, which probably looks like the kind of things that we see, we can say, okay, there's too much going on. We can eliminate some background noise. We can tidy up some of the elements. We can edit our text. Or maybe we could say that this visual should be represented as data. I love this example, flipping it the other way, taking data and representing it visually. This is another slide makeover from class, from a project at UIHC, and plotting that healthcare is more dangerous than some of these other activities. And you can kind of get to that from the chart, but it's easier when you have a compelling visual. So speaking of colors, as our guide moving us through all of this, I said I'm moving through red, blue, and gold, and we're just been talking about data. So it's a great time to talk about what's on all of these slides for a lot of us, because it's often charts and graphs. So if I left any of you back in elementary school when we were talking about the color wheel, you can stay there, because it is a worthwhile reminder that we keep these skills, language and math, separated. We kind of always have. We learn in language how to put words together. In math, we learn how to make sense of numbers. And then we get 2 siloed off applications for words, numbers, visuals, and all of that helps us make stuff that looks like this. And I bet there's folks out there looking at this thinking, oh, come on, what's wrong with that? You're thinking it's fine, but fine is far from exceptional. So we want to move beyond just showing data and to storytelling with data. Storytelling with Data is the title of a great book, which we also use in class, called Storytelling with Data by Cold Nussbaumer Knaflic. And she notes that human brain power is finite. And I love this metaphor because we think of our brain as like a processor, like a computer. That's why before I got on here, I shut down everything else because I didn't want the fan to start humming. I didn't want the applications to start chugging and slowing down. So our brains are the same way, and we want to preserve our audience's processing power too. And we looked at that cluttered slide from before, and it's a good reminder to avoid clutter, especially with complex quantitative information. So clutter defined would be elements that take up space but don't increase our understanding. So a quick step-by-step decluttering that can help us to eliminate this. One thing that, again, the it's fine stuff, here's a perfect example of it, but a lot of these come off the assembly line with a lot of extra clutter that we don't need. Take, for example, that great big heavy border. It's the heaviest, darkest line on screen, so our eyes go straight to it. Now, you might not think, I don't think that's distracting me too much, but this looks so much better. Speaking of lines and line weight, you can also simplify, or if you're comfortable doing so, remove the grid lines altogether. As we look at other things, one thing that makes lines and bars so great and so effective, and why I'm not a huge fan of the whole cornucopia of other visuals that we have as well, is our eyes naturally follow the endpoints of those lines and bars. So much so that we don't need data markers like these ones here. Now, we can also clean up our axis labels. Those trailing zeros there on the y-axis don't really add anything. And we see the months running across the bottom. It's angled text. What's wrong with that? The problem is, back to the audience's brain computer, is it's that much harder for the audience to process it when they have to read at an angle. Now, months are easy, but months also have abbreviations. So a simple adjustment takes us from that to this. And we see that we have a key or legend, which you absolutely want, but we can tidy that up by labeling our data directly. Back to the small adjustments, the good to great stuff that takes our slides from being average to exceptional, the audience can follow it that much quicker if they aren't having to go, which was which was which. And the other thing that helps with the which was which is if we can use color consistently with our text color as well. So with 6 simple steps, we did some pretty easy things there, and we took it from average to exceptional. So some guidelines with clutter. Not all data are equally important. When detail isn't needed, summarize. Push necessary but non-message impacting information to the background, and ask yourself, would eliminating this change anything? And that's where I'm a big fan of a little exercise that I call the optometrist test. Because if you're thinking, oh, I've worked real hard on this, I don't know if I want to delete that, just copy the slide, the graph, the visual, make a second version of it, and remove what you're wondering if you can remove, and then go back and forth, kind of like you're at the eye doctor. 1 or 2, 2 or 3, 3 or 4. Speaking of the number 3, no 3D. It's not helpful. We think it's cool, but it's clutter because it doesn't increase our understanding. And in some cases, it can actually mislead our audience as well. Just like we said, 1 idea per slide, in general, unless it's incredibly simple, try to keep it to 1 chart per slide. We're not presenting from a dashboard. A person on their own can look at a dashboard, but it's very hard to present from. Other tools for directing focus: size. Relative size denotes relative importance, so you want to be consistent here. Position, where you're putting things on the slide. The Z flow comes into play here as well. And color is helpful in directing focus, because if you were in a place where you could talk back to me, or if you're in the chat, feel free to do that. But if I were to ask you, what do you look at first here? Most of you would say that red stop sign. It's why the stop sign is red. The yellow taxi cab, which gets extra points visually because it's in motion and it's a little blurry as well. So you want to use color sparingly and strategically. We use too much color and you've got the entire rainbow to make sense of on the left, or you can heat map that table and all of a sudden it's a little easier to follow. So as long as we're talking about directing focus, it's a good segue into engagement. Now, engagement, sort of like rhinestones, right? One or two, it's kind of enough to add a little bit of bling. But if we bedazzle a whole outfit, we end up being hard to look at. The same is true of our slides. So we want to keep those fancy transitions to a minimum. With your slides, there's some basic meat and potatoes expectations that you can set with your slides structurally. So set those expectations. We've focused on text slides, image slides so far, but there's also some other important types of slides that help as well. Scaffolding slides, like agenda slides, which we looked at earlier, header slides, breaker slides that provide just what it sounds like, a break between the different subjects, or if you're stopping for discussion as well, and ending slides. With that agenda slide, that's important. People always ask me, can I include one? Yes, but making sure that you're making it for the audience, not for you. A lot of times we fall prey to that teleprompter thing and have a whole bunch of text that we want to read there. And your title slide is a fun opportunity for something that's sort of like your book cover. So think about how you want to engage and visualize here as well. And why those breaker slides are so important is that according to research, attention drops off 10 minutes into a presentation. So that's why those reminders of where you're at section by section are key. And there also might be points where you don't use any slides at all. I was working with a client on their national conference in Chicago, and the keynote speaker for the event was Daniel Coyle, author of The Talent Code. And as I was working through his tech rehearsal with him, he warned me, which was a good warning to give for a big high stakes keynote type event. He said, I have slides, but there's a few points where I want to tell stories. So when he got to those points, and hopefully Ashley's not freaking out right now, but what Daniel Coyle did was, this is supposed to be there, by the way, he just cut to a blank black slide, because in a big ballroom, the slides go black. You look at who's on stage, because Daniel Coyle knew that slides should support your presentation, but they shouldn't be your presentation. Closing slides can be missed opportunities. Don't just leave it on something that says questions or thank you. Leave a key idea up that the audience can look at and have reinforced while you're taking questions. Your detail level in general, we've talked about keeping it simple for presentation, and that's because a lot of times we make these slides do too much. So if you've got a live presentation, you want to keep what's on screen simple so that they're able to process what you're saying and what's on screen. If it's something that someone is reading after the fact, that's a very different way to take in information. So that's why you can have more detail, more annotation. So you might have presentation slides that look like this, but when you send out a leave behind after the fact, it might need to look more like this. So instead of having this, what we end up doing instead is we create slides that have way too much information, and because they have to live on after the fact. Another thing that you can do is start with your visual slide deck and print a slide doc or export to PDF from the print dialog box with text in notes view. You can also start with leave behind level detail and then copy a version that you can then quickly simplify as well. You can also create leave behind level detail that can serve as an appendix after your presentation. But your leave behind doesn't have to look exactly like your slides. This was an exercise that we did in class as well and got some really creative ideas that were on topic with what the presentations were talking about, but reinforced it with leave behind information after the fact. And I'll bet there's folks out there thinking, that's really neat, but it seems like that's going to take a lot of time. But one of the biggest lessons that I find myself saying across classes in all sorts of different workshops is that it costs you time to save your audience time and processing power as well. So how about some exceptional next steps, not just average next steps, because we want to move beyond that, beyond the, it's fine, because I'll bet most of you are right now creating slides that are fine, but we want to get better than that. As Dan Rohn, who's author of a great book on visual communication called Back of the Napkin, that takes this a step further and gets into some of that hand-drawn stuff, says, when it comes to sharing ideas, the tools that got a lot of us here are not the tools that will get us where we need to go. So that's where it can be helpful to have an exceptional slide deck, reinforcing visually what you're talking about. So, quick recap before I open it up to some questions, and it looks like we already have several down there in the Q&A, and a reminder to drop any that you have down there as well. But PowerPoint can do many things. If you need to use it to create a more visually engaging document, I do this kind of thing all the time myself, that's fine, but don't project it and read from it to an audience. Remember, these have been slide design principles, gray on gray principles, not black and white rules, to help you optimize your visuals for audience comprehension. Human brain power is finite. Declutter and use visual perception tools like size and color to further direct focus. Slides can also be key tools to enhance audience engagement and the first draft of supporting leave behinds as well. Now, with that, I want to say thank you. I want to open it up to questions, but remembering my own point about having something important up on screen while you do that, not just the word questions or thank you, which I put up right then and there. I will put this there, that it costs you time to save your audience time. So with that, I'm going to exit out of this and stop the share. So we've got full screen, everybody.
Yeah.
And I do see one big question that I can answer that was a direct message to me about my slides after the fact. And yes, I will make sure that we have a PDF of those as well.
Awesome. We're getting a lot of questions about that. So thanks for taking care of that one. So let's jump into Q&A because you have a lot of burning questions. So the first one is, how would you suggest incorporating engaging visuals while staying in line with brand manuals, like the University of Iowa brand manual?
Like, say, for example. Absolutely. And that's why, I have, I talk about this at events a lot. So I have the ability to use my own style here, but even this fits in with a template that I've created. And that's why I'm quick to point out that a lot of these things, like keeping your slides clear and concise, like visuals and incorporating full screen visuals, like that one of the teeth was full screen. A lot of times we tile images, and we don't have to do that because a full screen image goes with any slide template. So I'd say go back through and look at a lot of these, and you'll see that they have application that are not dependent on having a white blank page canvas?
Another good question, because we all do a lot of Zoom these days. With Zoom as a meeting tool often utilized, if not using PowerPoint, what else would you use to help the comfort level of a meeting so that staring at each other is not so distracting?
Yeah, I mean, that's tricky. And it's almost even, because that's another way to look at, I mean, we were talking about visuals in terms of slides, but we also talk about visual communication here also. And I think that's where it is important to look at to maintain consistent virtual eye contact. That's why I always try to, when Ashley and I were on beforehand, I spent 5 minutes getting all of the boxes and windows where I wanted them, like for my preview slide, because otherwise you can end up looking over here. So even little things like that help with visual engagement also.
So Justin Evans asks, when I am asked to present, I typically review sources and data, write a generally memorized private script, and an easy to digest slides that accompany with my script. I feel my process might be a bit more difficult than necessary. What advice do you have for designing an efficient creative process?
Oh, well, I mean, the biggest thing is you're asking, I mean, one, you're a process person, so it's easier to have a process and change a process than it is to start from scratch. So you've got the process part of it down. I would say look for what you need. For example, some people are script people, and that's a really important thing to help them type out their ideas. Even if they aren't memorizing that script, the act of creating one is a helpful one to present from. That's not how I work. I'm more of an outline person, and then I get up on my feet and start to practice it, and I see what works. And kind of dovetailing with your process that you were talking about there, I then start to develop some visuals that go with that. And usually the two go hand in hand. And my slides become sort of a visual outline for what I'm talking about. And it's kind of a virtuous cycle of helping me learn that content too.
It's a great process. I'm taking notes too. Here's another great one. Caitlin asks, how do you balance having less on a slide, but providing all the information? For example, if the slide deck is going to be shared afterwards, I want to ensure that all the background information that maybe I'm speaking to in person is also on the slide. So how do you manage that balance?
I would say it's a matter of balance. That's not to say that it can only be a visual with no words at all. So find what is the right balance of explaining this, but knowing also, and the asterisk kind of follow-up question of enough information, that's the tricky part. Because you, the human being, Caitlin, talking about this can add more detail. So you don't need to put it all on screen, because you don't want the audience reading your slide instead of listening to you. So the human being sharing information with you is the primary information source in the moment for a presentation. If it's something that is better as a document, then again, like that grid, that's why that consideration should be taken into account first, of what's most important for this scenario, and then decide what visuals make the most sense, whether they're presentation slides, whether they're leave behinds, or something in between.
So here's kind of not an easier one, but someone was just asked, Matt Canada is asking, can you kind of explain more of the 2 fonts and 3 color principle? So going back to the slides there.
Sure. And again, the caveat asterisk that I put on all of this is, I would encourage you to really think of these as well, you say principles there, as opposed to, that doesn't mean the world's going to stop spinning if you have 3 fonts. It also doesn't mean it's going to stop spinning if you only have 1. I have one in, I only use Montserrat in all of this, and a lot of fonts, good fonts, have lots of different weights that you can use lots of different things with. So I would just say, as you start to add more, again, remember, we all have laptops in front of us. And when we make these wonderful machines do too much, they start running slow, the fan turns on, and we don't want the same thing to happen in the audience's brain. So too much color, too much in terms of fonts can be, well, too much.
Well, speaking of fonts, many people would like to know what font was used in today's presentation.
Montserrat in almost all of its sizes. So that's, if you're kicking the tires of fonts, I always think it's good to have ones that have lots of different sizes and that are readily available. Montserrat is also a web font, so I can use it on my website also. So,
how many times would you recommend practicing for a formal presentation? How many times do you practice before a formal presentation?
yeah, that's a really good question. And it kind of harkens back to that point of process too. I think practice, just about anything. No one is born a great leader, a great presenter. It all takes work and practice. So I'd say it depends on the comfort level of the material. I'm sure we've got folks on here that are in HR, training and development, and probably have a presentation that they have down cold, forwards, backwards, and they give a lot. And you probably get to a point where you don't need to practice all of it, that much. But as you're working out new material, I do think, again, it's back to that, it costs you time to save your audience time. For example, this very talk, as you can imagine, I give versions of different pieces of this in different shapes and sizes. But as I was looking at this, I really didn't have a 40-minute slide deck piece. I have less that is part of lots of other things, but I was putting together a lot of things that I knew well, but this was a new combination for me. So I did some practicing here.
Lisa asks, can you provide your perspective on a summary for the slide at the bottom of the slide? For example, we have a wide bar at the bottom to put in the main slide point. Ooh, I think that might be getting a little technical. Can you provide your perspective on a summary for the slide at the bottom of the slide? Oh, is she talking about the note?
I think if yeah, feel free to thumbs up, chime in again if we're interpreting this, if we're interpreting this correctly. But it sounds like one solution to the leave behind is we all have these presenters notes. And another way you can take with them to get it's kind of a scrappy tactic to create a leave behind, is if you write, and this kind of gets back to that last question of a lot of detail, take that paragraph or 3 short sentence or whatever, and instead of putting it into, or instead of putting it on the slide, put it in your presenter's notes, because then, and when I said print that out for a leave behind, most of our computers, you go to that print dialog box and you can export your slides as a PDF. You can do so in handout form. You can click the box that includes the presenter's notes, and then all of a sudden it's got your visual and a short summary next to it. If you have more text, you can do that in PowerPoint in what's called Notes View, that allows, it basically gives you a page version of that with one slide at the top, and then you can add a couple of paragraphs below that as well.
I like this question from Rob. Are there different principles for a PowerPoint presentation to a large audience versus a small group of like 3 to 5 around a table at a business meeting?
Say that again. I was being irresponsible and reading the other comments, and I have another point I want to add in after that. But say yes, that last part again.
No problem. Are there different principles for a PowerPoint presentation to a larger audience versus a smaller group, like 3 to 5, around a conference table?
Absolutely, absolutely, and it gets back to that kind of now with more hand gestures here. I don't know what this is, but I'm glad, hopefully you're with me. But that Nancy Duarte plotting this out on audience size and level of formality. because if it is a smaller group, you've got some more relaxed rules. Maybe you do want to put something more complex up there, and it isn't necessarily about information transfer, about you sharing this with them. Maybe it's a process diagram that you're talking through, so you might put more up there. But in general, when you have a smaller group, you've eliminated some of the variability, where when you're communicating to a big crowd, it's hard to make one size fits all. So that's why you have to, as the group gets bigger, you have to keep some of those principles a little more simple in their application. And I want to, again, apologize to Rob and Ashley for stumbling over that question. But there was a great point made, because I didn't bring this up, on the question about templates. And I saw a comment from Ali from UI, talking about directing that, opening that conversation up. That's such a good point. And I'm glad that Ali mentioned that, because a lot of times, especially about visual high impact things like slide decks, we tend to think, oh, I've got to use, or I'm going to get in trouble. And a lot of times those groups, like Ali noted in his comments, said, we love knowing what people need more of, because a lot of times, maybe there's, oh, we're in sales and we're showing a lot of data. I need a more simple type slide, because there's a lot of elements. I know I've seen some that students have brought in. It's like, we got to have the corporate logo. We got to have the product brand family logo. You got to have the colored accent color stripe. And then by the time you start adding complex data sets to that, it can be a lot to look at. So like Ali is fostering here with the conversation on UI slides, talk to the team that does that and share what it is you're trying to do. Because more often than not, when you do that, you start good conversations that lead to better visual solutions.
Yes, Ali is the Chief Marketing Officer at the University of Iowa. So if anybody is on this call or on this webinar from the University of Iowa and you want to talk brand strategy, brand templates, Ali is your go-to guy. So thank you, Ali, for raising your hand and opening that door to that conversation, because you're absolutely right, Nick. It's nice to know that there's some flexibility and you're not going to get your hand slapped if you go a little outside the boundaries. When it comes to formatting the colors and the fonts of my own templated slides, sometimes that's really complicated and I'm not the best at it. Are there any free slide decks or resources that I could refer to?
There's lots of great tools out there when it comes to free resources for engaging slides and the visuals on those slides. I'm a big fan of Canva, which is a tool that you can do a lot with for free. And they kind of have a lot of, I love the brand story of Canva, and I share the founder's story, Melody Perkins, a lot, because it was about how to democratize graphic design. And there's a lot of easy color combos, but if you want to remember that, I have the color wheel up. It helps me just remembering that those complementary colors that are right across from, I'm doing this an awful lot. That's apparently a key visual for me. But those colors right across from one another on the color wheel are safe combinations to use. And that's why look at a lot of sports teams with two colors. It's why the Denver Broncos are blue and orange, because they're across from one another on the color wheel. Minnesota Vikings, purple and gold. So lots of safe combos there.
So Tracy asks, what if you're facilitating a training and introducing an activity with instructions? For example, if there are 2 questions you'd like a group to discuss, is it okay to have a text on a slide, or would you recommend it's there for them to reference, but it's not boring?
Yeah, no, I would, yeah. See, and this is an important level of, boy, if we were going deeper on this, I think the text that goes on our slides, I think like that example that I had from dentistry, where she was just kind of thinking and writing it right onto the slide, that we should think a little more carefully with the text that we put on a slide. So for that point, I would put some simple instructions, because if I'm thinking of this, how I use this in workshops that I do, I put a simple version of the instructions so that I can leave one slide up on screen while everybody's in their groups or individually working that they can reference, but it doesn't have everything that I said. And a lot of times we'll, type a whole paragraph for one step. So I maintain that some of the hardest language to write is technical, instructional, easy to follow steps.
I would agree. We have a couple of minutes left and we have a lot of questions. I'm not sure we're going to get to everything, but here's a few more. So Nick, we'll do our best. How do you
Lightning round.
Yes. How do you help others embrace these principles without becoming responsible for formatting endless revisions for them? What questions help you coach others the most? That's a great question.
It is well phrased, and it had the slight tone that you've become the slide person at your organization. And I think opening up, kind of like the point that Ali just made, of having more conversations about this. I talked about Storytelling with Data by Cole Nussbaumer-Knaflic, a book I have right back here. And there's some great design tips in here, but she also has a section at the end for how to apply this at departments, at workplaces. And one of the ideas, she talks about having a book club and talking through it, but she also talks, if you're making slides a lot, have little monthly awards, best slide, or just best slide. If you're comfortable and candid enough with one another, worst slide, but definitely a best one so that you can keep setting that bar high visually, and like the elite point of opening up the conversations around visuals as well. Because the other thing I use when I reference art class a lot of us have a lot of baggage from that, of we have a lot of shame of, I can't make slides that are pretty. And it goes back to art class, that we didn't think our drawing was as good as someone else's. But a lot of times just opening up that dialogue can be a long ways towards doing that.
Any tips for finding good illustrations, like not photos that don't look like clip art that everyone else is using? Did you do your own illustrations for this webinar today?
Yeah, I did. That's why I'm a bad non-replicable, but on the glasses half full side, mine don't look like anyone else's, but I love drawing, and I've illustrated some of my books, as well as Henry Tippie's Laws, our little book back there. Canva, again, has a great source. And I think the other thing that you want to do, and one thing that keeps things from looking clip arty, it's not really a word, but cohesive, or keeps them from looking like clip art, is if it's a cohesive set, and how you're using those, so that it's not, sometimes I see people kind of Frankensteining together process graphics out of different, and that one's like a 3D house and that one's like a two-dimensional person. So find something with a full toolbox with lots of different things.
Well, we have hit time for today, Nick. So I wanted to ask you, if people have questions, how do they reach you? I know that your email was up there, but can we pop that back in? I can pop it into the chat here.
If you pop it into the chat, I'll say, feel free. I am imminently findable. I have my own website, but also the UI website, various emails, contact forms. I'm happy to help however I can.
Awesome. Well, I just want to say thank you, Nick, and thank you to everyone for attending our webinar. Wonderful questions. As a reminder, when the event ends in just a moment, you'll see our quick survey. We'd be grateful if you could share your thoughts and help make our future virtual programs even better. On behalf of the Tippie College of Business and the University of Iowa, thank you so much. And as always, go Hawks.